Hey guys! So for my thematic analysis, I chose the theme of faith, and the verse that I chose as the foundation for this theme was Deuteronomy 7:9, which says, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him, and keeps his commandments to 1,000 generations." So by dissecting this verse and the stories of Abraham, Moses, and Esther, we can identify faith as a common theme throughout the Old Testament. So Deuteronomy 7:9 refers to knowing that God is God and that he is faithful enough to keep the promises that he makes. So for that reason, this verse can be seen as a foundation for the Old Testament, which is constantly speaking of God's faithfulness and fulfilling his promises. Countless stories throughout present the evidence of this truth. So the first story, Abraham, everyone knows what happens in Abraham, but God promises descendants as numerous as the stars to him, but there's one problem, and that is that his wife Sarah is barren. She can't have children. But God tells him not to worry about it, and he's got it under control. And ultimately, God rewards them for being faithful to him, and they give birth to a son, Isaac. This promise is the foundation for the rest of the Old Testament, and all the other stories in the Old Testament are about Abraham's descendants. And this shows that God is faithful to the promise that he made. This comes to fruition in the New Testament with the birth of Jesus. And Jesus ultimately continues to add on to Abraham's descendants by making a way for spiritual descendants to be added to his line. So not just his physical descendants, but also like spiritual descendants. So then we have Moses. We analyze Moses, so we know what happens in that story. But God continues to be faithful to his promise, and he delivers the Israelites from the deadly bondage that they were under in Egypt. So he makes it so that they can continue to grow numerous, so they don't have to keep dying off. This is paralleled in the New Testament when Jesus comes and frees us from our symbolic bondage to sin, just as God freed the Israelites from their literal bondage. And finally, we have Esther, good old Esther. So she's made queen, and the king's advisor Haman has this deadly plot to kill off all of her people, the Jews, and he doesn't know, not knowing that Esther is a Jew. So ultimately, she risks her life, having faith that God is going to spare her because she could walk into the throne room and the king could order her killed. So she walks in. She goes before the king and she says, "Please spare my people." She advocates for her people. And the king spares them. So again, we see this story paralleled in the New Testament when Jesus says that he is our advocate and that he intercedes for us at the foot of God. So faith is a term that transcends the hundreds of years between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The prophets had faith that God was going to send a savior, and Jesus confirms that faith was not in vain. Essentially, Abraham was ultimately placing his faith in the coming of the Messiah, a savior that was going to add to Adam's family, and not just his earthly family, as I said before, but also like this spiritual family, like you and me. So how should we as Christians display this theme of faith? Well, just as God promised to come through on his end of the bargain by being faithful to us, we have to do the same. It's imperative that we follow God's commands to make more and better disciples and to obey every law that he has. If we truly have full faith in who God says he is, then bringing other people closer to him should be the deepest desire of our hearts. And so, by analyzing those three stories, we see the common theme of faith that was displayed. Of course, there are so many others like Ruth and Daniel and David, just to name a few, but the point still stands that faith is the common denominator. It's the foundation of the Bible. So please comment your thoughts. I can't wait to hear, and I can't wait to interact with you guys. Thanks!